Permission to get up at any point, take a cookie, or it's an all Pepsi campus. I don't know what, I'm new to this campus, but it's ridiculous. You can't find a Diet Coke anywhere. My name's Scott Lasensky. Thanks for coming to this event. I'll say a word about the speakers in just a minute, but first, a plug for the Pomegranate, the Gildenhorn Institute. There's some other great events coming up. I'll just mention them quickly. Chuck Freilich, who's a tremendous scholar, practitioner, Israeli, is going to come and talk about national security, Israeli national security, February 27th. There's a film, which will not be in this place, but 2 floors up, David Derry, a film about development towns in Israel and North African immigrants to Israel, March 26th. Ambassador Dennis Ross, who's a colleague of Robert Satloff, is going to come here for an annual lecture. It's the Dubin Lecture, April 9th. Anybody know what April 9th is when it comes to Israel? This gentleman, of course, knows. Happens to be the Israeli election, so it's going to be a bonus set of issues to discuss with Dennis that night. April 30th, Nissim Calderon, who's an Israeli poet, is doing an event here. A lot of courses on Israel. Mine, Professor Shan. It's a program with lots of courses on Israel and a journal. I'll flag the journal, Israel Studies Review. Paul is the managing editor. I'm holding it in my hand. It's produced here at this university, at this institute. It is read in a virtual way online, but you can still hold one. I'll pass it around. People want to touch and feel it. For me, it's a personal delight to have this particular group come and talk. 2 gentlemen here, Dr. Satloff and Professor Telhami. We were all joined together on one incredibly emotional project. I'm going to remind them, Rob probably hasn't thought about it for a long time, but at the U.S. Institute of Peace, we all served on a committee to commemorate Sam Lewis. I should say to honor Sam Lewis, because he was alive. Sam Lewis of blessed memory was a legendary American ambassador to Israel. And he came from a generation of American diplomats that, I don't know, it's safe to say, they sort of stand like 9 feet tall. That was a very special project. I remember the night when we inaugurated the room. And Elisa Catalano is someone I worked with in the government, the U.S. government. Our senior colleague at the time described our work as a foxhole. Because it often felt like you were in a foxhole in a warlike situation, and if you can emerge from the foxhole and still be friends with people, it's an extraordinary testament to human relations. Remain friends and colleagues with Elisa. I'll say a word or 2 about them, and then we'll kick it off. We have this great screen here. Rob Satloff is the executive director. The title doesn't really, it doesn't fully communicate the fact. He sort of is the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. The 2 are synonymous. The Howard Berkowitz Chair. Remind me again the title of the book that you did on North Africa?
Among the Righteous.
Among the Righteous. Wrote an extraordinary study on the period of World War II and the Holocaust in North Africa during a sojourn to Morocco, which was turned into a film. It's really a pleasure to have Rob with us. Professor Telhami is widely known, ubiquitous presence here around the campus. Anwar Sadat Chair, member of the government department. It was an honor for me. We're co-authors of a book called The Peace Puzzle, which was a lot of fun to write. And Elisa Catalano, who worked at the State Department and the White House, the National Security Council, for about 10 or 12 years on Middle East issues. And today teaches at SAIS, at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and works at the Center for New American Security. I am going to, I'm going to go through, we're going to have 2 rounds of questions. Not surprise questions, things that we discussed over email. We'll hear from the speakers, and then we'll turn over to everyone. We'll spend most of our time, if you're not eyeing the cookies, we'll spend most of the time in a sort of group discussion. We'll end about 5:30. I'll ask my question, then I'll sit down. Make it easier than visitors. Well, I'll just sit down. As the invitation states, we gathered for what I called midterm assessment. We had the State of the Union just a few days ago. This is the middle of President Trump's term. We're here not to talk theoretically or in esoteric terms. We're here to talk about policies that have real practical impacts. We are all, I think, quite aware that we're in an applied field. So we're going to spend the next hour and a half talking about the real-world impacts of real decisions. And I want to begin with one very broad question, which is simply, it was partly sparked by an event that Rob hosted a few days ago. When you look at President Trump's record on Israel and the Middle East, setting aside all the rhetoric and all the emotions that this president often conjures, I want to ask all three of the speakers if they see more continuity or change. When you answer, if you could, and I'm fishing a little bit, but I'm hoping they'll all spotlight a particular issue, different issue, in answering this question about continuity versus change, and then also add how you think that particular decision or that policy has landed. 2 years is not 2 days, and it's not 2 weeks or 2 months. 2 years is a pretty good stretch, and it's a good time to take stock. Can I start with Rob?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Great. Scott, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here at Maryland. I have to say, the last time I was on the campus, Maryland was still in the ACC. And see, my wife and I both went to Duke. And I took my then 11-year-old son to the basketball game here. And he was totally blue-faced, cheering for Duke regalia from head to toe. We were sitting in the Verizon box. I thought someone had given me tickets. It was really nice tickets. But the guy in front of me actually turned around and said, "If you don't tell that kid to shut the up, I'm gonna pop him."
We're recording the event.
Right.
self-censored.
I self-censored. So I just wanted to applaud the enthusiasm. Look, this may sound odd, but we are now 10 years into a great national experiment where 2 successive presidents have advanced a Middle East policy of diminishing American presence and diminishing American engagement. 10 years, for the first time since World War II. We are 2 years into an experiment in which the leaders of both American political parties, the leaderships of those parties, also advance an American policy of diminishing American presence, shrinking American engagement in the region. Donald Trump and Barack Obama having a similar policy, and they talk so differently and act so differently? Yes. Now, it doesn't apply across the board, but it applies strategically. Both of them articulated a view. Obama a bit more eloquently, but Trump a bit more directly, that the Middle East is a swamp from which we should find a way out. That our interests there are far more limited than people normally think, that we are spending and losing lives and treasure, and we need to get out. For President Obama, the main strategy of getting out was to rebalance the equation in the Middle East between Iran and Arab states and Israel, and allow America to leave after the Iran nuclear deal had created a more level playing field. For Donald Trump, the overall strategic objective is similar, but the tactics are different. On the one hand, his tactics were to restore a different type of balance, and then just to get out. So we've seen a lot of things, the move of the embassy, embracing the Saudis, whatever. But the big strategic vision is still to diminish America's role, and we saw it at the State of the Union, which was, if anything else, it was the political equivalent of Clint Eastwood escaping from Alcatraz. It was Donald Trump using that spoon to escape from the Middle East. There was nothing there about why we're in the region, why we have purpose, mission, strategy. It is all about leaving. And that's, I think, the similarity.
A bit counterintuitive, and thank you. It's an issue you raised in this program I watched a few days ago that you led. I want to just quickly ask you to tack on one further thought, then I'm going to come back to you before we move on to Elisa and Shibley. Impact. It's clear from the tone of what you said that you don't think that's a very smart approach. But do you want to? Can you spotlight with either President Obama or Trump? What's been the impact? Why is it so? The way you describe it, why has it been so bad?
I think this is the wrong approach to advance America's interests in the region. And basically, I'm of the view that the Middle East produces very little that the world wants, but it's great at exporting insecurity. Great at exporting insecurity. And we have two choices, ultimately. We can invest in a variety of ways to help diminish the level of insecurity and help Middle Easterners at least begin to address their problems there, or we can essentially play defense and wait for those problems to try to either make it over a big wall, land at JFK Airport, or do other things to bring that insecurity here. And I'm of the belief that we're better off as Americans trying to limit the insecurity and help them solve problems there. That does not mean, I'll just end up on this, that does not mean that every Middle East problem is solved through the 82nd Airborne Division or through tens of billions of dollars of money throwing at it, which is the canard that is often thrown at people who now argue for engagement.
I want to give you one quick comment to sit with and think about, because I'll move on to the others, but one of your peers, the head of another think tank in Washington, General John Allen, I happened to be at a conference last week where he spoke in Israel, and if he was sitting here today, I think he might take issue with your fundamental assessment, or at least your starting point. He spoke at the INSS conference last week, and he spoke about President Obama restoring a equilibrium or rebalancing, and this idea of a diminished footprint. Some might argue with, but maybe just think about that. You said the 82nd Airborne, so I obviously thought of the good general. Elisa, where do you come down? Continuity, change, what's that? He's a Marine, yes, I know.
He's not a soldier.
Okay, sorry.
Let's make that clear.
Marines are
Go on.
Marines.
There's a difference.
Elisa, continuity or change? What have you seen more of? Pick a policy issue that spotlights this, and how has it landed?
Thank you for having me, Scott, and thank you for to all of you and to my colleagues for wanting to be part of this conversation. I think I associate myself with Robert's statements by and large. I think at the strategic level, the kind of thrust of both the Obama administration and the Trump administration's view of the Middle East does have a certain continuity to it. It does have kind of as its centerpiece this idea that we're overinvested, we're overcommitted, et cetera. I'll make two quick additional points to that, and then I'll move on to a policy issue. One is, while they may have the same strategic thrust, I do think that they manifest operationally and tactically quite differently, and that matters because that has secondary and tertiary impacts, as we're already seeing in the context of decisions just in the first 2 years of this administration. And we could arguably debate that there were any number of secondary and tertiary impacts to the Obama administration's decisions that weren't all that great either. So how they manifest matters. The second point I would make that is important for those of us who work in this business to remember is it ain't so easy to disengage from the Middle East. And the Obama administration felt that, despite their over-intellectualized, sometimes over-deliberative approach to this disengagement, and to what I would call a more schizophrenic approach.
The overly deliberative, just so you know that Lisa's talking about being trapped in the Situation Room at the White House through morning, noon, night, 7 days a week. Is that what you're referring to?
Maybe. I might be referring to the inability to kind of get yourself out of the thinking box. Or this team, or this president, whose view is perhaps to be more the seat of your pants. both of those things have impacts, and both of those things make it difficult to actually execute against that strategic objective of disentanglement. So while I agree on the continuity point, I think the policy issue I'm going to talk about is one that isn't necessarily one that reflects continuity, and that's one of the obvious ones of change, and that's the Iran policy, right? And this administration's decision to withdraw the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, which I don't think came as any surprise to anyone. I mean, the president telegraphed it throughout his candidacy and certainly over the course of the first year of his administration. You know, I think the running joke amongst those of us who watch the space is that why it took so long. But certainly no surprise that that change was going to occur, and that change was going to be, in fact, a centerpiece of this administration's early years on Middle East. Now, when you look at Iran policy more broadly and look to assess it, I think this is where you get into a little bit of trouble and a little bit of less clarity. If you accept the proposition that this administration has put Iran as a centerpiece, or one of the centerpieces of its Middle East policy more generally, and that its goal is to extract any number of concessions from Iran, whether it be a better nuclear deal, whether it be restrained influence in the region and beyond, whether it be a change in domestic and regional policies. This administration has articulated a position that that's where it's going. So how has it done? Meh is what my answer would be, right?
We're at a university. Could you give them a grade on Iran? Would it be a C, a B, B minus? Come on. No grade inflation.
I'm not grading on a curve. D plus.
D plus. Okay.
Why? So I think we can talk about two neutral to positive things that the administration has done first. One is that its decision to extract itself from the deal and reinstate unilateral secondary sanctions does cause pain. It causes economic and financial pain. And Iran is feeling that, whether those on the left here want to admit it or not, whether those in Iran want to admit it or not, that pain is felt. This has a caveat though. Unilateral sanctions mean that pain is felt incrementally. It's not felt at the level of maximalist pressure that this administration is seeking to achieve. But that pain is being felt. The second positive that I would outline is the administration's decision and the president's personal decision to reinvest in relationships, picking a side in many cases in the region, whether it be trying to rebuild his personal and administration's relationship with Israel, whether it be his embrace of places like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or Egypt's leader. He has certainly telegraphed that these relationships are important, that in fact he intends to invest in them, and that he sees them as central to executing this broader Middle East policy, whether it's vis-a-vis Iran or whether it's more broadly. But here too, I think that telegraphing is sometimes a little confused, and you're not really sure what day you're going to get a message that is pro these partners or against. And symbolism comes at a cost, right? We can talk about that a bit later as well.
So you may graduate, not going to make the dean's list.
We'll see. I mean, here's where I may disagree.
It's a midterm assessment. Yeah.
I may disagree with Professor Lasensky that 2 years isn't all that much time for a complicated policy to produce results. So, I say that recognizing that I'm not entirely sure how you would have graded the Obama administration 2 years in. And there would have been a whole lot of positive to say necessarily. So we'll see. But I'm not optimistic.
Sure. I mean, to be fair, many observers say that this president hasn't been faced with a true foreign policy crisis. Most presidents, they come with ideas, but they're often known for how they react to the crises that they encounter. And for 2 years, he's largely been given a free pass. Maybe in the next 2 years he'll face what all of his predecessors have faced, which is stark choices. Professor Telhami, continuity, change?
Well, thanks so much, first of all, for inviting me. Thanks for organizing this. I feel very much among friends on this panel, and I've known everyone here. Scott is my co-author, as he mentioned, known him for a long time. In fact, Scott contacted me when he was still a graduate student writing a dissertation at Brandeis, asking for advice on American aid, foreign aid at that time. And Scott had, and you know, Rob Satloff has been now, of course, the anchor of the Washington Institute, as Scott had mentioned, but he may not remember. The first time he contacted me was actually in the 1980s. I believe I was an assistant professor at the Ohio State University. He called me and he said, we're putting together this new institute that is headed by this man, Martin Indyk, for whom I'm working. And I wanted to see if you could join us for some conference that we're putting together. It was before even this thing got started. And I remember that very, very distinctly. And we have certainly done a lot together over the years, including served on task forces. And Rob has been one of the really important voices on the Middle East here in Washington. Elisa, you've done a fantastic job. Your reputation is excellent, particularly what you did in the White House during trying circumstances. So I'm glad to be here. And Scott also undersold himself. He too became a diplomat, not just a professor and a scholar, and has served as the key advisor really to the U.S. ambassador to Israel for a number of years. So I'm glad to be here. Let me start with the continuity, and I agree up to a point with Rob on the continuity. I think when you look, for example, in effect, as what happened in this administration policy towards Syria, it's not substantially different from the Obama administration. The president really doesn't want to be involved there. He was pushed into it to differentiate himself a little bit from Obama. He wanted to look a little tougher here and there on the edges. But ultimately, he's doing what Obama probably would have done, more or less, give or take. So I don't think there's anything really significant there. I think, however, it is too generous to refer to what this administration is doing as a policy, or to refer to it certainly as a grand strategy. I think what we have here is something far less and much more incoherent and much more unpredictable than is suggested by the idea that this is a coherent policy or certainly a grand strategy. I think we do have a presidential instinct that is a non-interventionist. We've seen that throughout, although the president himself has been somewhat contradictory in his record over the years. By and large, he's more of a non-interventionist. He really doesn't, I think, want to intervene in places. He doesn't like to leave American troops there. He thinks it's a burden. And in that sense, I think he's in a way much more libertarian, if you might argue, in his approach to his instinct. And I say approach because we've seen this man contradicting himself. But let's keep in mind that that instinct isn't the only driving force in American foreign policy. In fact, he is surrounded by people who don't agree with him. In fact, most of them don't agree with him on this. Their instinct, certainly, if you talk about National Security Advisor John Bolton, if you're talking about Secretary of State Pompeo, that's not where they're coming from. If you talk about his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, if you talk about the people he appointed to be envoys to the Middle East, they fit more in the neoconservative realm, I would say, than they do in Trump's world. And I think this president has shown that it is relatively easy to manipulate by allies and foes alike, by advisors and outsiders alike. And so where the president will end up falling on this isn't at all necessarily going to be reflective of where his instinct is. It's why, for example, on Iran, where I think his instinct may not be to go into confrontation with Iran, I see a whole set of circumstances that have emerged and are emerging where he could find himself on a slippery slope toward confrontation with Iran, even if he doesn't want it. So therefore, I wouldn't give them the credit of calling this a policy. But I want to also talk about the discontinuity. There are two things that are really remarkable here, I think. One is really kind of institutional and process-wise. This is particularly with regard to Middle East peace and to the Arab-Israeli issue, the Palestinian-Israeli issue. This is the most breathtakingly inexperienced group to have this kind of dominant role on the Middle East that we have ever seen in American foreign policy. It isn't unusual that we have inexperienced people coming from the outside. It isn't unusual that you have a White House wants to make their own decisions and want to minimally be responsible to executive branch, the State Department or the Defense Department. But we have never really had this level of insulation, where the president himself doesn't even listen to the intelligence hearings. He doesn't like to hear anyone's opposing advice, to the point that briefers are told ahead of time, make sure you don't disagree with him too much because he wouldn't listen to you, he wouldn't like that. Where the advisors, particularly the ones on the Arab-Israeli issue, and I'm speaking of his son-in-law who has an oversized role, Jared Kushner, I'm speaking of Greenblatt, Jason Greenblatt, I'm speaking of the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, the three key players really in shaping American policy toward Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They are not only breathtakingly inexperienced, coming out of basically real estate businesses. They've not only never served in government before, but never even focused on this issue before, except through personal relationship, mostly with the Israelis. And never have we had people who have come with an ideological baggage already that is at odds with every administration that we've had, Republican or Democrat, particularly on the settlement issue. So we have an incredibly unusual process. And that this particular issue, the angle of the relationship with Israel through this limited number of people, with a president who's mostly golfing or tweeting, that this has in fact been the starting point for the rest of the Middle East policy. So the fact that they want to confront Iran comes out of the fact that Iran is a threat to Israel. The fact that they want to make peace with the Arab world and the Saudis is partly tied to the fact that they want the Saudis to weigh in to extract concessions from the Palestinians, not the way around. That is really the cornerstone of the policy, not the president's instinct for not to be engaged. That is really what's shaping and framing the approach. So one final point on this. So in effect, separate from the process and the way this has worked itself out in comparison to other administrations, what we find here is that the policy itself was a break with everything we have known in American foreign policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What do I mean by that? I don't mean simply the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. That, of course, is a break. And I have certainly opposed it. Some people make an argument for it. Let's put that aside. But what I'm talking about here is something completely different. I'm talking about the entire American approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was that this is taking place in the context of a particular framework that takes into account international resolutions, international law, prior agreements, a certain sense of equity. And what this administration has labeled as, quote, principled realism, which is neither principled nor realism. I'm a student of probably the most influential realist of our time, Kenneth Waltz, who was my mentor at Berkeley. This is not realism. And I think with that I agree with Rob. This is not realism. Although on this issue with Rob about exporting, the Middle East exports of security, he's absolutely right. We've seen it, we've witnessed it. But I would put it the other way around. Much of that insecurity is exported to the Middle East because of our intervention, not the other way around. I mean, look at the insecurity that we have seen following the Iraq War and our intervention in the Iraq War that has led to so much more insecurity in the world than prior to that period. So on this issue, that break with existing American positions, I see that as a huge break, and that is really the driving force of what they're trying to do in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Shibley. That's a very clear and stark definition of what may be the most profound discontinuity. Because you gave me a nice plug, I'll just add on to that a separate issue that is also reflective of the discontinuities, and thinking about our pomegranate up there in this institute, just to give you a sense of how the U.S. relationship with Israel looks kind of at eye level, at ground level. I'll give two issues that popped up. One when I was in government, one more recently. And you see these stark, different, vastly different approaches. In 2015, there was a bill before the Israeli parliament to put certain restrictions or certain policies around NGOs, how Israeli NGOs would operate. The Obama administration, in which I worked, took a very unusual decision. Normally, the U.S. government doesn't get deeply involved in matters that are almost entirely internal to the country. And we engaged, and it's a story that takes more time than we have here now, but over a period of some weeks and some months, the bill that was passed by the Israeli Knesset looked very different. And some of that has to do with the Obama administration getting involved in this decision on this NGO bill. And it's not hard to understand why. Go look at President Obama's national security strategy, for example. There's a section on values, and you can kind of read the president's view of the role of civil society around the world and how they define that in terms of American interests. It wasn't all that unusual, and it was done in a careful way, in a calibrated way. Fast forward 3 years, look at last year. Again, coming down to eye level, the Israeli government passed a measure about 14 months ago, that they were going to embark on a massive deportation of African asylum seekers, refugees, infiltrators. A lot of terms are used. The Trump administration took no public position. I don't know what they were doing behind the scenes, but there was absolutely no message, not a word from this administration. I can guarantee you, as much as anyone can guarantee, if President Obama was in office, you probably would have heard. And on this issue, you ended up hearing from the U.S. Congress and from American civil society, and you see two issues here. Again, they're bringing foreign policy down to things that are relatively modest, an NGO bill in an Israeli parliament, and the status of 40,000 refugees. But you see two dramatically different approaches to internal questions in Israel, highlighting different worldviews, and also highlighting, this is sort of my segue, highlighting perhaps different calculations about domestic politics. If we could just do one more quick round and open it up to others to ask domestic politics. Not a new subject when it comes to the Middle East. But under President Trump in these last 2 years, there's been tremendous focus on the question of the domestic sources of foreign policy, the domestic resonance. I'll read quickly from a line, from a letter that was written by half a dozen Democratic members of the House Foreign Relations Committee. After, this wasn't about the Jerusalem embassy move or about the change in policy, though there's something behind if you read between the lines, but this letter was simply about how the opening of the embassy was staged. Representative Engel and Ted Deutsch, they're both now leaders of the committee, they wrote the following: "We worry that this may be part of a dangerous effort to politicize the U.S.-Israel relationship, which has long enjoyed bipartisan support." Has domestic politics, I want to ask all three of our guests, has domestic politics risen to a new level? Is this something we haven't seen before? Is it overplayed? How do you judge the impact of domestic politics? Can we go in the same order? Rob?
I guess now is not the moment to respond to earlier comments. Right?
You can if you want. I'm trying to keep everybody on the focus.
All right, I'll answer the question. We'll get back to that.
While you answer the question, I want to pass this around. Sure. I couldn't get it up on the screen, but and we don't have to spend time reflecting on it. But the domestic politics question works on both sides. Look, so these are the ads of Netanyahu and Trump that have been floating around in Israel this week on billboards. Just going to pass them around.
Look, the short answer for me on domestic politics is biblical. This is nothing new under the sun. This is not new. and even in the Arab-Israeli arena, even in U.S.-Israel relations, go back to the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. Domestic politics always had an impact on American Middle East policy, and rightfully so. That's what democracies are all about. Democracies are supposed to reflect the, to a certain extent, decision-making is to a certain extent supposed to reflect the views of engaged citizenry. So now on the so I don't think it's substantially different in the 2 years of the Trump administration than in previous administrations. On the Jerusalem embassy issue, I happen to support it and actually help the administration in a certain respect conceive of how to implement it. I think they executed it quite amateurishly. I think that having the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem is a perfectly reasonable and wise thing to do. I think the way they went about it that day in the embassy was a mistake, and I wish they hadn't done that, and actually undermined some of the principles that were laid out when the president issued the statement in support, explaining the embassy. But the larger point is it somehow more domestically focused today in the last 2 years than in the previous. I mean, we could do a dissection of presidential terms going back, and I think you'll find that in every one, the domestic political impact is substantial, if not always determinative, but substantial.
Substantial, not always determined. Could we skip the order for one sec, partly because I know Shibley, you've told me you're doing a lot of work, a lot of thinking on evangelicals.
Right. Right.
Do you agree with Rob?
I agree with Rob on two counts. One is that this is not new under the sun. That is that domestic politics has always been an important part of American foreign policy, on almost every issue, and certainly on this one. And I don't think that itself is particularly unusual. In fact, I will say something a little bit more than that, which is I actually think that this president is slightly less responsive to domestic politics than others. Now, let me tell you why I say that. I know that, let's take the Jerusalem embassy. Okay, and people say, well, this is what the evangelicals wanted, or this is what Adelson wanted, and I think that's true. Both of them wanted that, and they pushed for it. But here's the thing: just before the embassy move, I did a public opinion poll here in the U.S. A majority of Americans opposed the embassy move. Among Republicans, it was divided. It was slightly more supporting than not. I think it was something like 44 to 40 or something like that. But divided Republicans. The evangelicals were only slightly supported. That is, that 54% supported the move. They were not itching at the bits to move the embassy. It's not that they didn't support it in principle, but they weren't pushing him for it. That wasn't something and with that, I would say, I think that's a rationalization of an explanation. He says, I've promised, and therefore I'm delivering. I think that's a rationalization. I think we need to look deeper at what really drove the administration to do it. More than that, this president, we know, of course he cares about public opinion. He watches them, he follows them all the time. But look, he's been governing, he has never had anything close to 50% approval rating from the day he started office. He's been below 50% throughout. And he made it his strategy not to get there. And from day one, he basically said, I got a core, and that's a base. I'm going to cater to that base. It's roughly 35%. And I'm comfortable with that. I could push it up a little bit here and there, but I'm comfortable with that. And that's what I'm going to do. And the thing is, with his fake news strategy, he has actually been able to influence his base more than be influenced by his base. He caters to them symbolically, but oddly enough, when he takes a position, then they rally behind him because it's like identity politics. He's basically embracing them on the symbols and the images that they support, and that they seem to switch to policies to support him, even ones that they've historically not supported him on. So that where the issues are not really the driving issue, it's more about identification with him for what he stands for. And therefore, I think his capacity in some ways to get his base to follow him is pretty powerful. And on Jerusalem, right after he did the move, then a lot more people supported him on it because he just did it. And right now, I do public opinion polls here throughout the US. And what we find, of course, it's the polarization is unbelievable. It's not a substantive way. On immigration, we have 90% of Republicans opposing it, 90% of Democrats supporting it. There is no way this is an objective analysis of those issues. And that's sort of, you know, what's going on. With Israel issue specifically, though, you just distributed this picture, which is a powerful picture of, in that particular case, it's Netanyahu who's using his relationship with Trump to benefit him electorally. Now that works for Netanyahu. And how do we know? I did a poll on Israel last year. And in that poll, I asked them to have a favorable, unfavorable view of Trump. The majority of Israelis, about 60%, have a favorable view of Trump. And that seems to hold, I should say, Jewish Israelis. The Jewish Israelis, Arab Israelis feel differently. But that seems to hold across the entire spectrum of Israelis. That applies to Haredim, to Datiyin, and Hilonim. All three categories have a favorable view of Trump. So for Trump to be endorsing or seem to be an ally of Netanyahu, works for Netanyahu in Israel. Now, does it work for Trump here? Now, I should say I did a poll here during the election campaign in 2016, and I asked in an open-ended question, whom among world leaders do you admire most? Republicans ranked Netanyahu as the #1 most admired leader in an open question, tied with Ronald Reagan, slightly ahead of Ronald Reagan, actually, in 2016. And now, in the most recent poll, he's #2 only to Trump. So Netanyahu actually still plays among Republicans, among the base, so it works both ways. You know, they both play each other for their own politics. But it might be working less for Trump now, because while most Republican, 57% of Republicans, want the U.S. to take Israel's side directly in mediation efforts, the overwhelming majority think it's doing that in fact, which means far more people think Trump is taking Israel's side that want Trump to take side, which tells you that they may think he's doing it too much. So can he overplay that card? That's another question.
Thanks, Shibley. It's a powerful set of comments and a lot of consensus with Rob, at least on the role of domestic politics. Elisa, what do you think? Is it Trump the strategist, Trump the politician? Nothing new under the sun?
I think Trump's the exploiter. I don't think there's much strategy behind it, but it's not anything new that politicians and presidents in particular have to respond to domestic politics and adjust to domestic politics. I think what's interesting and perhaps maybe slightly more unique about Trump is that he reads the domestic politics, he reads his base, and he looks for how much latitude that gives him to do things that are actually quite unpopular amongst his senior advisors, amongst political elite, amongst the Beltway intelligentsia. And so, how he uses those domestic
What's an example?
politics.
Syria, an example?
So Syria is an easy example, right? Where I think his judgment, to the extent you want to use that word, was that he would have political support from his base and from those who broadly believe that, again, intervention in the Middle East has not done much for the United States since 2001, and that's not going to change, and it's certainly not going to change remaining in Syria and investing both capital, resources, and political attention. Khashoggi is another perfect example, I think, in my mind, and one that's even more stark, where the lack of domestic concern, interest, reaction, particularly from the base, but arguably more broadly, gives latitude to policy positions that may offend and scandalize those of us who do this for a living.
Well, just to you say those of us Senate Republicans That's not the swamp. These are core Republican leaders in the Senate. There was a mini revolt over Khashoggi.
Which has amounted to what exactly? Right? I mean, I think you're right, but I still count that as Beltway intelligentsia, as the political elite. That's the exact establishment that Trump actually is proud not to respond to, right? But that gives him latitude to not take a position on something that, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, certainly the previous administration, and I would argue administrations before that, would have felt compelled to take a position on publicly and privately. And that's, you're not seeing that here, because the dynamics in the domestic politics for this president allows him to operate in a way that we just don't expect. And that's where he operates at his best, arguably, right? Where he does things that are unpredictable and inexplicable to those of us who think we know his game.
Unless you're Shibley Telhami and you're just looking at that 35% and trying to calibrate. Thanks, Lisa. I want to open it up and let people jump in. I'm going to take this mic, Lisa, if I can. I'm going to give one of these to people here. I've got a question. It's on. If you don't mind, just introduce yourselves when you ask a question.
Hi, my name is Matan Berkowitz. I'm a senior here at the University of Maryland. So earlier, that picture was passed around with the Netanyahu Liga Achet, right? Him standing next to Trump. So it seems that with the upcoming elections in Israel, Netanyahu has fully allied himself with Trump. He's trying to play on that image. Obviously, they both have the corruption thing going on, possible indictments on the way, but something that we're seeing, despite Bibi doing his best to make his number one competitor seem like a leftist, it would be questionable to call Benny Gantz a leftist. Now, in the off chance that Gantz wins, how do you see Trump changing the relationship with Israel? What becomes of that? He all of a sudden is very aligned with Netanyahu. Do you think he would there be retribution? Would he suddenly change his perspective? Obviously, I'm asking you to predict Donald Trump, right? That's not an easy call, but I'm curious what you guys think.
Can we maybe ruminate on it, and we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then do another round. So pass that around. I'll add to Matan's question. He mentioned Trump Gantz. We can add, maybe that'll be a restorative dynamic for the Palestinian dialogue, which has been cut to zero since, if you saw in the tweets over the last day, the Palestinian leadership's been endorsing Gantz. So, did you see somebody's crazy? Here, please.
Hi, I'm Derek Boyd. I'm a retired physics professor, and my question relates to the U.S. military. They are very heavily invested in the Middle East and seem to be strongly committed to continued involvement. And this has provoked a serious clash between the military and the president. And I was wondering where you think this conflict, this internal conflict in the United States, will be taking U.S.-Israeli policy.
Great. 2 very different questions. Maybe we'll just hold the mic for just a sec. Post-Netanyahu U.S.-Israel relations and civil-military relations. Trump and the Pentagon. You want to take a shot? Rob, you want to start?
Sure. I just wanted to first inject a historical note. I mean, the Bibi Trump picture is an episode, and we're going to see more of this because Bibi will be in Washington at the end of March. Right. So we're going to have live photo of Bibi and Trump in the White House. 1996, Bill Clinton actually went to the Middle East and arranged a full summit with to help Shimon Peres get elected and Sharm el-Sheikh. Mm-hmm. So, as I think it's nothing new under the sun. But again, these things are sometimes they happen, sometimes they don't. But they're not. It's not like Trump is redrawing the map. The answer to the question, I'm quite convinced that Benny Gantz will fly to America if he's the next prime minister. Be happy to shake hands, and Donald Trump would be delighted to bask in the glow of this military hero, just the type of guy he likes to bask in the glow of, and they will have a perfect relationship because it's in both of their interests to have a very good relationship.
I'm not an expert in internal Israeli politics, but I think that's exactly the right answer. But I will start getting at least to part of your question. The tension between the occupier of the White House and the military is not a new thing, yes? I from personal painful experience, saw it every day during the Obama administration. And so I think there are a couple of good takeaways from that. One is whether it's the U.S.-Israeli military relationship, whether it's the U.S. fill-in-the-blank military relationship, the benefit of these strategic partnerships is that they run pretty deep, they're institutionalized, and to a large extent can weather some of these tensions that are personality-driven. That's not always the case, right? There are some muscle movements that occur to try and shift those things. But I'd say the tide usually pushes against it quite a bit, or at least tries to stall that progress so that it doesn't have unintended consequences, which, in military parlance is probably the worst possible thing that could ever happen to you, right, is an unintended consequence. So I'm pretty sanguine on the idea that even in this context, the foundations of the military relationship doesn't change all that much. There was a lot of debate in the Obama administration about deployment numbers to the region and what did it mean when there was one less striker or one less carrier in the Gulf, et cetera, et cetera. And what I think there is good to remember is that that posturing, those footprints, they change all the time. They don't necessarily reflect a depreciated capability in the region. Most of the folks I talk to at DoD would say that we're still overstretched in the Middle East, right? So the idea of reinvesting or increasing military involvement, posturing in the Middle East is not necessarily something that I hear folks at the Pentagon arguing for. Sustainment is probably more along the right lines, and that's where I think the fact that the relationships like the U.S.-Israeli security relationship has so much depth to it that it's really hard for that to move all that quickly in significant muscle movements.
So on the question of what's after Netanyahu, I agree with Rob that generally I don't think that's going to be affected. But I will say that on the margins, it is in the following way. Netanyahu has become a household name in America, and he's been around for so long. He's had a role in our domestic politics. Republicans see him like another great Republican leader for them. And certainly in the Iran nuclear deal, his speech to Congress, his successor will take some time to get there. And so that has been an asset for Netanyahu, is that he's, aside from the relationship with Israel, he's been a fixture that will take time to get over. On the military, I think we have to differentiate between two things. The drive for war and the drive for military presence. Now, the military doesn't really like wars. They don't want wars, and I don't think they're looking to get into war with Iran. I don't think they want to expand the military role in Syria and Iraq. I don't think they like going to the Iraq war, as you know. Many of them have resisted that, and in a way those who have resisted were pushed aside. But they do see, in a way they agree a little bit more with Rob on the strategic picture. They see that the U.S. is more of a peaceful presence, that it's for security, it's better to have American presence around the world and enhance it and have influence and preempt things that might be there. So I think that's where they come in against the instinct of people like Trump. For example, if you're looking now at the withdrawal from Syria, it isn't that the military is itching to keep 2,000 people there. Some may, but it's more about how they build alliances. They have their own view of what the influence is. They have their way of doing things. When the president doesn't even consult them and has a plan, say, I'm going to get out tomorrow, and it leaves them out, and they don't like that. Same thing with Afghanistan. Sure, you know, that you can make an argument, as the New York Times editorial did a couple of days ago, powerful one, that we need to get out of there. We're not serving anybody's interests. It's become our Vietnam, and might become even worse. You can make that argument, but still, you got to figure out a way to disengage that is sensible, that goes with their plans, that they can figure out how they're going to plan strategically for the vacuum that will be created. And they don't like civilian leaders not to coordinate with them. And so in that sense, you find that kind of tension, but I don't think it's a tension about whether to go to war or not, because I don't think most of them are going to go to war.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the surface. I think maybe we'd all agree. At the end of the day, they're getting, at least so far with Trump, bigger budgets, fewer deployments. So the military is probably going to be.
Mattis's resignation has no particular meaning.
Talk about Mattis.
Yes.
Meaning in what?
Certainly not. Well, I would say maybe
Here
Shibley
you
can
have a
comment.
situation where the Secretary of Defense resigns. Right? And there's clearly a conflict with the President there. Surely this has repercussions, one within the Defense Department and within the administration. So,
No, it's a great
Yeah,
point.
I mean, I think we all might have something to say on it, but I think the issue here is, again, keep in mind, if you are a professional in this government of any kind, whether you're military, whether you're in the State Department, whether you're in the CIA, and you are in any briefing with this president, or witnessing what this president is doing, or disregarding your professional advice, it's driving you crazy. And you are trying to say to yourself, what am I better off staying? Some of them can't afford to leave for their own careers. But even if you're looking for the greater good, am I better off finding a way to serve my country despite him, or am I better off, quitting right now? And that is a choice for a lot of people. I'm going to say everybody, of course not. That we have too big a government and we have a lot of differences. But I think that's true of the professionals. And Mattis was in that particular case, I think after the Syria decision, on which he was obviously not consulted, I don't think he could work with this president.
Rob, did you want to get in?
Jim Mattis is the first executive officer since the Carter administration to resign on a matter of principle. And I think it has a very important significance. And actually it goes to something I wanted to take issue with my friend Shibley. Namely, Shibley, I understand why you argued it, but you made a case. I think I heard you say that Trump that his advisors are all. That Trump doesn't trump his advisors. Oftentimes, the advisors are working around Trump. I think
not quite that way. He just leaves them to do the business because he's out golfing
or
tweeting.
But actually, the point I want to make is, on the really big questions, Trump gets his way. And despite the advisors. In this case, an advisor was collateral damage. So all the advisors urged Trump, don't rip up the Iran nuclear deal. They got it 6 months, they got another 6 months, and then he said, time's up. That's it. He got his way. He got his way on Syria, even though,
Got his way on the embassy. Tillerson and Mattis, we all here said don't do it.
They had very, I think, much a lower decibel level of disagreement than the level of disagreement there was on the, not just on the ripping up the Iran nuclear deal, but on not waiting another 10 days, 2 weeks to see if we could reach an understanding with the Europeans, which was quite close. He got his way. And here, he got his way again. Now, it's important to remember, even on the serious stuff, we're talking 2,000 deployment. This is not September, this is not 2003, 150,000 people to Iraq. This is not Bush administration, 1991, 500,000 people to Iraq. This is 2,000 people where the professional military had a view about their utility. So it's a fairly small thing. The idea that he stuck Syria in the paragraph on endless forever wars in the State of the Union is an insult. It's new, and we've had, up until his decision to leave Syria, the total number of combat deaths in Syria was 2. 4 all told, 2 by accident, 2 in combat. 2. I mean, it's 2 too many, don't get me wrong.
He's the one who sent the troops there, no one else.
And he's the one who sent the troops. So don't get me wrong, it's 2 too many. So my point is, he really is not George W. Bush. He is the decider. And when he makes a decision, it's going to happen.
Let's take a second.
I got
Sure,
two
sure.
finger.
Jump in.
So I think the fact that the Syria deployment is 2,000 is actually quite important, because there are tens of thousands of active duty American soldiers, airmen, Marines, and sailors deployed in the Middle East in that area of operation, and have been for an extended period of time, and I don't see any of them coming home anytime soon. So when you think about it in that context, yes, the Syria decision may feel like it's a massive muscle movement, and I think for policy reasons it is. But in terms of active duty deployment, I'm not entirely as confident that those 2,000 are actually going to leave as quickly as the president wants them to, for all kinds of reasons. But in the relative scheme of the presence of U.S. military in the broader region, that's been sustained pretty well, and has stayed at a similar level for quite a while. And I don't hear the president talking about changing that necessarily. Wars are one thing, but that really is Afghanistan. But overall posture, I think, is a totally different conversation.
Tom, right behind you, I think, is one, or next to you. Yeah, we'll do a few. It's okay. Please.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Miller. I'm a senior government and politics major here. So the 116th Congress just started. Democrats have taken the House, as we all know. But we already see the Democratic Party in the spotlight in terms of 2 or maybe 3, in some cases, very strong critics of the U.S.-Israel relationship, particularly in regard to the BDS movement. So how do you see these 2 or 3 voices, new but very loud voices, coming into play in terms of the Trump administration's posture in the Middle East and Israel specifically?
Good, let's take it, but we'll just add a few questions to keep things moving. Right behind you.
Totally different question to you.
That's fine. We're not going to group them. Everybody gets in. Everybody gets a shot.
Mostly for Professor Telhami. Bill Rudolph. I'm a local rep. So you said that in the poll, I think, of Republicans, that Trump and Netanyahu were like 1 and 2 in popularity. Who was 3?
Actually, there aren't many. The distance between them and the third, I want to say Merkel in the last poll. I'm not 100% sure.
As long as you don't say Putin.
But no, unfortunately, that's not the case.
So anyway, I think among American Jews, in general, who are not Republican, like 3/4 are not, they would be lumped together at the bottom of the survey. And you said that Netanyahu is like a fixture for American Jews. He is, but it's
among Republicans.
Yeah, but among most American Jews, he's
most American Jews are
bad
not
fixture.
Republicans.
Yeah, are not, and the 2 of them are lumped together, which doesn't help Israel at all in the eyes of American Jewry, apart from the Republicans. Well, my other question is, you said, I think, that a lot of the moves of Trump, I guess you call it, about the Middle East really are about helping Israel. His relations with the Saudis and other decisions, certainly the Iranians, like it was all about helping Israel. And is that true? I don't feel that way. I think Iran is a bigger problem than just relations with Israel. So I just wonder if you could say that, or the other people could say
I'm going to tack on also to the question. I think people often too put too much weight on this notion that 80% of American Jews didn't vote for Trump. In fact, if you look back a year ago, the New York Times, when the American electorate was sliced and diced every way you can, age, gender, geography, ethno, American Jews were, they were, I think with African Americans, the two most negative attitudes towards Trump. But what I want to ask the panel, especially Shibley, my sense is that when it comes to policies, not voting at the ballot box or self-identification, that the Jewish community is actually quite split on Trump. Unanimously opposed on the domestic front, and quite bipolar, to use a psychological metaphor, on Israel and Middle East issues. But let's hold the thought for a second. Let's take a third. Somebody wants to get. Maybe I'll ask a student. Tariq? Yeah, take the microphone. Two students, and then we'll get to the.
All right. Hi, Raburas. I'm a PhD student, government and politics, and at the Gildenhorn Institute. So we've talked a little bit about the Israel-U.S. relationship. I want to gear towards the Palestinians for a little bit. I mean, we tend to forget, but 60% of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza are under the age of 35, meaning that they did not know any other reality other than occupation. A plurality of Palestinians are under the age of 26, which is meaning they didn't know any other reality other than the Palestinian Authority. And anybody who kind of wanders around in the West Bank will know how much discontent there is with the Palestinian Authority. And it seems that the Trump administration in particular has been banking the authority to the extent where they're just barely above water, whether it's with their with the money we would support you only if you take away support from resistance fighters or whatnot. So since all of you are in the policy world, I was just wondering, how would you approach this issue with the Palestinians if you would meet with Trump? How would you approach this issue with the Palestinians? Do you think the American strategy towards the Palestinians should change, whether it's to kind of support elections or to try and a new, different kind of rapprochement? What would you have in mind? And a second quick question regarding Iran.
Very Washington of you to slip in a second question.
Regarding Iran, I mean, it seems that Iran is no longer significant on the agenda as it was just 1 or 2 years ago. Even Netanyahu's not talking about it much, maybe because he doesn't want to fall into Benny Gantz's trap. But even in the US, we do not see this discourse on Iran as it was before. And just as a proof of that, the United States is still not played an effective role in the Qatari, UAE, Saudi fight that's going on, which, I mean, if you're going to challenge Iran more directly, you'd want a unified front. But unfortunately, the United States has not been trying to heal that situation there. So is it really that Iran is not as significant to the policymakers as it once was, or is it actually the opposite, that they're trying to cool down the Iran issue and hope that maybe what happened in Venezuela over the last 2 weeks would eventually happen in Iran?
Those are all great questions. I want to just tack on the image and sort of focus people on the image of Mahmoud Abbas and Donald Trump, and just tack on to Farah's question. It's not just the money, the political dialogue is zero, right? The embassy, the mission here, the PLO was closed. The discourse just on Twitter, separate from all other media platforms, just on Twitter, the discourse, so perhaps the Palestinian-American relationship is the one that shows the sharpest contrast or the sharpest discontinuity.
Well, let me address the first two questions because they're really tied together in a way. And starting with this image, the Netanyahu with Trump image. Now, as I said, it helps Netanyahu and Israel across the board, I think. In the U.S., it helps Trump with his constituents. But it does hurt Netanyahu with everybody else. Because right now, people who don't like Trump partly associate Netanyahu as a friend of Trump. That includes American Jews, but Democrats broadly. And I think one reason why Democrats soured more on Israel, aside from disagreeing with Netanyahu's policy, is in fact that they see the Israeli leadership as being in camp with Trump and maybe even with Republicans broadly. And that has had an impact. Now, on the public opinion of the Democrats, I have been tracing in my polling over the past few years that Democrats have been less and less sympathetic to Israeli policy. They're not against Israel, and that's a kind of a misreporting, because Democrats don't say they're against Israel. They say when you ask them a question, do you want the U.S. to take Israel's side, the Palestinian side, or neither side? The overwhelming majority now say neither side. And those who want to take sides, they're only like 20%. They're almost equally divided between Israel and the Palestinians. So they want to be even-handed in compared to Republicans who, when you ask them the same question, you have 57% who say they want to take Israel's side outright, and very few who want to take the Palestinian side. I hypothesized in an article I wrote for the Washington Post 4 years ago that there is a gap between Democratic public opinion on this issue and congressional Democrats on this issue. That congressional Democrats are overwhelmingly supportive of the Israeli government on many issues that come before them. That's not where the rank and file are. And the question is, how can this be sustained over time? Or will this gap be bridged at some point? We saw that gap being bridged a little bit when Bernie Sanders spoke out more critically of the Israeli government. He actually reaped more benefit electorally, and now we see it in the midterm election. I don't think we could generalize too much from that, because those are in congressional politics, as you know, every district has its own politics, and you can't make the broad. However, there's one thing you can make a broad hypothesis from. Not so much the election of the three you were talking about, that is Rashidat Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Cortez. You can't really broaden from that, but the S1 bill that came out before Congress, which
This is the anti-BDS.
the anti-BDS, well, it's not anti-BDS, sorry, it's not anti-BDS, that is the label, because I don't think,
Fake
other
news.
than those two members or three members, you don't have Democratic members who opposed it who supported of BDS. So you had 22 members who voted against this, Democrats and one Republican, who were not. None of them said they were supportive in the Senate. None of them said they were supportive of BDS. So what they were against in that particular case was not simply the fact. There were two issues. One, that this bill did not differentiate between Israeli settlements and Israel proper, which was huge, and several members, particularly our own senator, Chris Van Hollen, highlighted that issue. And the second was that this intruded into civil liberties of Americans, that whether or not even if they oppose BDS, they support people's right to boycott. And that's what the ACLU has taken position on. So it was a civil liberties issue. But the fact that you had here all the declared candidates for president on the Democratic side, with the exception of one who might declare on Sunday, that the fact that they all opposed it, despite the fact that AIPAC backed it, was really something different. What we haven't seen. As I said, mostly they justified it over the civil liberties issue and maybe the settlement issue. Those are the two that they've kind of justified. But the fact is, they seem to be more concerned about democratic public opinion in running for president than they are about traditional politics in Congress. So that is new. That is important. I don't think that's just a response to the other question. What I was referring to here is that, look, the Arab-Israeli issue file has been given to Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner himself is the one who's clearly crafting the policy in coordination with the people that are around him. Trump, Rob may be right. Trump ultimately may veto something, and it's unpredictable. I don't know where he's going to come up. But for now, on this one, that's the case. And he knew Netanyahu very well. He was very sympathetic with the Israeli right in the settlement issue. He knew Israeli security concerns. That's the experience he had in the Middle East. And so he started off trying to advance this issue, sees Iran as a threat, sees an opportunity with Saudi Arabia. Whether the relationship with Saudi Arabia is 100% a function of this relationship or not, no, I don't know that for sure. I don't know what financial question, for example, we still are all these investigations about the president and whether there were other interests that might even be personal in this particular case played a role. There's no question that during the campaign in 2016, we now have extraordinary evidence that all these countries, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, had in some ways hoped that Trump would win, with some of them having activities trying to aid the election of Donald Trump in that election. So there is a story there that I don't think we can capture by sitting back as political analysts and thinking about this as traditional American foreign policy makers with some smart experts mapping out a grand strategy trying to see what's good. There's so much in there that is not that policy as usual, that it's going to take us a while to piece it all together.
Elisa and Rob, maybe you could split answers to Thayer's questions.
Yeah.
Can Palestinian-American relations recover from this downward spiral, and the regional question? Maybe you want to split that?
Sure.
Go ahead.
All right, let's start to get at the Iran question. I think this might be reflective of the fact that I spend a lot of my time thinking about Iran, so I'm not sure I agree with the premise of your question. But because I think the conversation about Iran is persistent. Maybe it ebbs and flows in terms of the degree to which people are emphasizing it or focused on it exclusively, but from the National Security Advisor, from the Secretary of State, from the intel chiefs, just as recently as their testimony, and you hear Iran in all kinds of contexts, and certainly the broader policy, media, political space talks about Iran, especially Iran in the region more broadly, with some frequency. I think the reason why that sense of urgency is maybe a little bit different now than it was before the withdrawal from the nuclear agreement is frankly because nothing really has changed all that much, right? There has been a massive movement on the part of the United States unilateral sanctions apparatus. But even there, we've seen adjustments, waivers, moving toward what seems like a more deliberate implementation of that policy. None of that's very sexy, right? By and large, the Iranians have chosen, at least to date, to continue to abide by the broad strictures of the agreement. I mean, I think we could debate whether on the margins they're continuing to push the envelope a little bit in some respects. In terms of their obligation, I would say they are. I think lots of folks would agree with that, but generally speaking, they're still in that space. I think if you saw the Iranians say they are now out of the agreement tomorrow, the conversation would change back to Iran. But in the context of the Syria decision of withdrawal, Iran obviously a central piece of that discussion. Why the administration hasn't pushed on the Gulf dispute? My personal view there is that the members of the dispute, the parties in the dispute themselves, are not interested in being influenced by the United States on this. I think there are long-standing issues that have manifested in the blockade over the last several years are deep-rooted, are personal, and they're not interested in giving up or conceding their position right now for what is the symbolic nature of having a unified GCC. And I think there, frankly, the United States puts more value on that than the actual members of the GCC do. So I think that's why you haven't seen more of an effort, because I don't think they're interested in the effort.
Rob, you want to tackle the second part? Or the first part of this
There was a
question?
second part?
The second part,
Sorry, the first part.
so paragraph 2 of
The downward spiral in American-Palestinian relations.
So,
Political relations.
look, there's two things I wanted to say. I'll just use the questions as an opportunity. Yes, about U.S.-Palestinian relations. I think it's a damn shame what's going on. And I say this as somebody who totally supported the move in the U.S. embassy. These things are not antithetical. And actually, I don't quite understand in the sense that the rationale, the ostensible rationale is because Abbas has, I think, irresponsibly decided not to engage diplomatically. The administration's view is, well, let's squeeze Abbas to compel him to engage diplomatically. Now, that would make a reasonable amount of sense if the money was going to a box. But the closing of the USAID machine had nothing to do with Hamas. It had to do with finishing up a garbage dump in Jericho, water facility, novels. Even the UNRWA money. I have no love lost for UNRWA, and I'd love to see the institution disappear tomorrow. But getting rid of the UNRWA money, the way the administration did it, was a huge dereliction of duty. Because they should have used that $350 million to leverage change in the organization. The end result of just picking up your chips and leaving is that the organization is as dysfunctional and malevolent and contrary to the cause of peace today as it was when the United States was giving them the money. And they found the money elsewhere. So they didn't achieve the objective by picking up and leaving. I think it makes no sense for us not to continue to have a relationship with the Palestinian Authority, and certainly with the Palestinian people, far more important than the Palestinian Authority. Just one sentence about the Palestinian Authority. And it's sort of difficult to hear. It is just another dysfunctional Arab state. It actually is right in the middle. If you look at almost all the indicators, whether it's literacy, investment in education and health, and it's right there in the middle. Higher than some, lower than some, higher than others, lower than others. It's actually not doing that bad. But it is stuck in neutral. And that's a problem that Palestinians will have to address. One sentence on the BDS congressman. I'm not concerned about 3 congresswomen and views about BDS. But I am concerned, and you saw this at the State of the Union, is a confluence of the left of the Democratic Party and the right of the Republican Party that is driving both parties to adopt a view of isolationism, of America Firstism, of get out of the Middle East, bring us homeism. And you saw it when Donald Trump announced the endless wars paragraph. It was one of the only moments of the evening, other than the happy birthday to this wonderful gentleman from Pittsburgh, the only moment of the evening where Republicans and Democrats on a policy matter stood up and cheered together. And that got me scared.
And that's not going away.
Because we hit 5:30, I was going to beg the speakers, I'll let them have a last word if they need, but I'm hoping we could go offline, and for anybody who wants to pile on, we can speak more informally.
That was a really depressing note to end on, though.
No. Well, first of all, we have an obligation in this room here to provide first Dr. Satloff basketball tickets. He's got to come back. It's been 30 years, or 20 years. Go get your basketball tickets. We'll bring back Elisa as well. I want to just thank the speakers, first and foremost, not just for their time, but for their honesty. We heard about Donald Trump, the libertarian interventionist. We heard about Donald Trump, the exploiter. We heard about dereliction of duty. Rob's going to see that on Twitter from someone in this room, probably. They were very honest, creative.
If you do it, quote me exactly. I don't mind. Quote me correctly.
Please join me in thanking all of them.